The child development program known as Project Head Start was launched in 1965 as part of President Lyndon B. Johnson's War on Poverty. This social initiative identified quality early childhood education as a crucial element to eliminating generational poverty in the United States. 4 years later, Migrant Head Start was developed to address the unique challenges faced by migrant agricultural families. The program, however, did not come into being spontaneously. Numerous political and social events in both Mexico and the United States led to the establishment of the Migrant and Seasonal Head Start program that we know today. Many Latino Americans have learned little about their history. Like other communities of color, the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community, women, and other disenfranchised and stigmatized people, Latinos have been left out of the history told in classrooms, families, and broader society. The lineage of Latinos in America goes back to an era when Mexico had become a highly advanced civilization. Art and architecture had become highly developed, and society's values did not allow for hunger or homelessness among its people. The concept of private property did not exist, and the land and its riches belonged to the people. In the ancient societies of Mexico, people valued cooperation over competition. In the early 1500s, Mexico began to change as the Spaniards, or Español, arrived and claimed gold, the land, and its people. The indigenous Aztecs resisted the invaders, but ultimately failed as millions died from European diseases and bullets. By the Spanish conquest of 1521, a new people had emerged as children were born to Spanish fathers and indigenous mothers. For the next 300 years, the Spaniards continued to conquer and enslave the indigenous people. They, along with other nations such as France, continued to search for gold. They explored areas such as New Mexico and Texas and claimed land as their own. Traders and trappers also came, and eventually Spain established a system of Catholic missions to colonize the California coast. In 1821, the Mexican War of Independence ended Spanish rule and Mexico became an independent country. Later, in 1865, the victory of the North in the United States Civil War left industrial capitalists with great power. Their wartime contracts left them with enormous profits that they funneled into railroads, mines, and farming. Cheap labor was needed, and poor conditions in Mexico drove laborers north in search of these difficult, low-paying jobs. Mexicans helped build an economic empire and infrastructure that was worth billions, yet controlled by the economic elite. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, dissatisfaction over work conditions and low pay led to strikes by railroad workers, streetcar brakemen, miners, and agricultural laborers. In 1914, 12,000 mine workers went on strike against the Rockefeller-owned Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, seeking better conditions, increased wages, and union recognition. The strike resulted in the Ludlow Massacre, a 14-hour ordeal in which 18 people were killed, half of which were Latinos and children as young as 3 months of age. The Mexican Revolution led to a new constitution in 1917, and though it was progressive in many ways, the rich eventually restored their control. As a result, millions of Mexican farmers were unable to make a living and moved to the rural and urban slums of the United States. Many of those Mexicans built and worked on the railroads, making up 70 to 90% of the railway workforce in the West. Later, many migrated east to complete railways across the United States. In the Southwest, Mexicans mined metal and mineral deposits, and hundreds were brought to Pennsylvania under contract with the Bethlehem Steel Company. Others worked in meat packing plants and agricultural fields. Low pay, substandard living conditions, racism, and exploitation were common experiences that prompted strikes for higher wages and fair treatment. Mexicans and Mexican Americans fought and died alongside other marginalized people in these strikes and were labeled as aliens and blamed for economic crisis. However, this early activism would lay a crucial foundation for the civil rights work to come. During the Great Depression of the 20s and 30s, Mexican labor was no longer needed in the face of massive unemployment, and workers, some already American citizens, were deported. Similar to today, the economic crisis was blamed largely on undocumented workers from Mexico and the poor. Later, as millions of troops were sent abroad to fight in World War II, the decrease in available laborers prompted the U.S. government to seek workers from across the border. The Bracero, or manual labor program, went into effect and brought 50,000 Mexican agricultural workers and 75,000 railroad workers into the United States. While many Latinos moved to the cities to take jobs in industry, over 500,000 went to fight in World War II, mostly as foot soldiers in the Pacific, North Africa, Sicily, France, and Germany. They were told that they were fighting for democracy, but at the end of the war, they, along with other minorities, returned home to face continued discrimination in the country they had fought to protect. The 1960s saw the convergence of civil rights and social movements in the United States. Latinos, along with other people of color, joined whites, women, the LGBT community, and activists from across marginalized communities to push for social justice. In 1962, over 100 years of activism had set the stage for Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, and Filipino organizer Larry Itliong to establish the United Farm Workers of America in support of workers' rights. 1964 saw protests against the Vietnam War, and during the same year, the Civil Rights Act was passed in an attempt to end legal discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And in 1968, the Indian Civil Rights Act was passed, extending most of the guarantees of the Bill of Rights to Native American tribes. The 1960s saw marginalized groups together and individually fight for dignity and equality in public policies, education, and broader society. Latino and Chicano activism was strengthened as the fight for civil rights continued. And after a long history of forced assimilation into white society, the decade left Latinos emboldened to embrace their traditional cultural identities and to stand up for their communities. From first contact with the Spanish in the 1500s to the battle for civil rights in the 1960s, over 400 years of struggle culminated in a social and political climate ready to embrace programs in support of Mexicans and Latinos. With this groundwork laid, a small group of Texans created a life-changing child development program serving migrant farm workers living in poverty. Established in 1969, that program developed into Migrant and Seasonal Head Start. Today, the nationwide program serves thousands of children and families each year with critical school readiness, health, nutrition, mental health, disability, and family engagement services.